Good afternoon. I'm Greg Fletcher, Program Director at the Caltech Y, and I'm very excited to welcome you to our program today. 15 years ago, the Y embarked on the first of our annual Washington, D.C. science policy trips, and it developed as all Y programs do, from student ideas and with student leadership throughout. I would really like to thank all of the students who've been involved with leading these trips in the past, from the student with that first idea, Pat Neal, to today's leaders, some of whom you will see moderating today's student-led program. I would also like to thank our policy experts who've given up their time over the years. Our first four, John Andelin, Mike Nelson, Bill Colglazier, and Michael Ledford, have seen our group every year in DC since, and now many others have as well, including one of our guests tonight, Dr. Córdova. Of course, there were also many at Caltech who helped us make connections and get the program going, like Hall Daly, Caltech's former Director of Government Relations, and our other guest tonight, Dr. Baltimore, who we sought out when we began the planning process. Last but not least, I'd like to acknowledge the support of generous individuals, the Friends of the Caltech Y, the George Hausner Fund, and the Institute that make programs like this webinar and the DC trips possible. Without further ado, I'll pass things over to the first of our student leaders to proceed with the program. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, everybody. My name is Eduardo, and I'm a grad student in the bioengineering program at Caltech. And I'm super happy to be your moderator tonight in this conversation between Dr. Baltimore and Dr. Córdova on science and policy. So let me introduce our guests. First, Dr. Córdova. She was most recently director of the National Science Foundation, which led for the previous 6 years until March 2020. She got her PhD at Caltech in 1979 and went on to work at Los Alamos. Then, in 1989, she joined Penn State as faculty until 1993, when she was poached by NASA to be their chief scientist. Then, from 1996 until 2002, she was vice chancellor for research at UCSB. And from 2002 to 2007, chancellor at UC Riverside. And then before joining the NSF, she was president at Purdue University. And most recently, she was elected to the Caltech Board of Trustees in June this year. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Franz Córdova. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Our second guest is Dr. David Baltimore, who is familiar to most people in the audience. He came to Caltech in 1997 to be Caltech's president, and he was in that role until 2005. Dr. Baltimore got his PhD in 1964 at Rockefeller University, and he was faculty at MIT for almost 30 years, where he studied RNA viruses. He was one of the first to identify the enzyme reverse transcriptase in the virus particles that he was studying, and this led to him sharing the Nobel Prize in 1975. In the 1970s, Dr. Baltimore also played a very important role in creating a consensus on national science policy regarding recombinant DNA. And in particular, he did this through the Asilomar Conference. He served also as founding director of the Whitehead Institute at MIT from 1982 until 1990. And of note, he was an early advocate of federal AIDS research. In 1986, he co-authored a report where he was asking for $1 billion for research from the federal government, and they got it. Currently, Dr. Baltimore research focus is on the mammalian immune system and on how to engineer new therapies. Dr. Baltimore, it is a great honor to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Sorry, I was muted.
Okay, so to open up our panel, I have a question for Dr. Franz Córdova. In your undergraduate studies at Stanford, you actually studied English, and I read that you did anthropological work, and then you went to get your PhD at Caltech in astrophysics. Can you tell us the story, how you made the switch, and most importantly, at least for me, how did this early formation shape your view of the interplay between science and society?
Well, thank you very much for that question, Eduardo. And thank you to the Caltech Y for inviting me to join you. The Y has always been very special to me ever since I was a student at Caltech, when it had great programming that I really enjoyed. And I also enjoyed the visits to DC and getting to talk with the students when they were in DC about science policy and our programs at the National Science Foundation. So yeah, I'm the kind of person that just likes to do a lot of different things. I have many different interests. I have friends, who, for example, who like art as I do, and they collect in one genre, one particular kind of period of art. And I admire them very much for that, because my tastes are just totally eclectic. So when I was in high school and then college, I just wanted to try everything. I had wide interests. I was very curious about all sorts of things. And I loved science as a youngster, and my science classes in school and high school and science fairs and all the like. I also loved English literature and drama and debate. And when I got to Stanford, I attended classes in all sorts of things. And I must say, I think science teaching is much improved today. I was not particularly inspired by my short dabbles in various courses, although I did love my astronomy course. I thought that was great. But I received zero encouragement in science going all the way through high school, but a lot of encouragement in writing and literary critique and all the like. And so at Stanford, I just decided that that's what I would major in, and graduated with that. And I thought I'd go to graduate school in linguistics, and in fact was accepted to Stanford and as a graduate student in anthropology, cultural anthropology. I've always loved languages, and especially the relationship between thought and structure of language and all. But I needed a break. It was the days of the Vietnam War, and school was pretty, it was just pretty hard to keep staying in school. So I was anxious to get out into the world and do something. I had won a writing contest that brought me back east to New York City. And during that summer back east, I rediscovered science. I saw a special on public television about neutron stars, and I thought, oh my gosh, that's what I should be doing. I should be studying science and becoming a scientist. And so at that time, I had moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, to do an education project with the Caltech student body president, Joe Rhodes, who had just graduated. And so we started that project, and I saw that neutron star special, and that carried me to MIT, where some of the scientists were featured who were on the program. And that really changed my life. They accepted me into the laboratory. I helped write a review article on X-ray astronomy, which was brand new at the time. And so that was my initial steps. And because of that experience, I got to know who Gordon Garmire was, because he was one of the people contributing to the early days of X-ray astronomy. And so when I moved back to my hometown of Pasadena, I knocked on his door and asked him if I could work at Caltech. And he right away gave me a project in computer algorithms for the space programs that he was connected with. And that really set me on my career. A year later, after I'd taken some background courses at Cal State LA, they let me audit courses at Caltech. I did well enough that they admitted me as a graduate student. And so I was on my way to becoming a scientist. And then I think, Eduardo, in the introduction, you gave the rest of the story. So you wanted to know about how that's kind of affected the my outlook on science and society. And I guess it wasn't until I accepted the position of chief scientist of NASA, which was at the time I was at Penn State, my first faculty and administrative role as head of the Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics there. And I was interviewed by the head of NASA, Dan Golden, and offered the job of chief scientist. And that carried me into the policy world of science policy world. And I wasn't sure I wanted to do that at the time. I wanted to stay in research, but I thought it was an interesting opportunity to do as a rotator for a few years. And it really changed my direction. And I became more and more engaged through the years in thinking about how important it is to couple science and inform policy with good science. And that's just something that I've been passionate about ever since.
That is an awesome story. I'll admit that I did read, I did have a few spoilers when I was researching your bio, but there was a lot there that I couldn't find anywhere. Thank you for sharing that with us. So my next question is for Dr. Baltimore. Dr. Baltimore, you helped organize the Asilomar conference in 1975, and that was a crucial moment in the regulation of recombinant DNA research. At the time, there was a lot of fear about what were the possible hazards of inserting DNA, new DNA, into existing life forms, and people just didn't know what couldn't happen. And so there was a lot of unknown and a lot of fear. Right after the conference, you got the Nobel Prize for your work on viruses and on cancer research. And I understand that you made full use of that platform to help advance this conversation around the idea that scientists could be responsible stewards of the technology that they developed, that they could exercise responsible restraint. And from what I gather from this story is that enabled the scientific community to set the tone and the pace of this conversation. And in the end of the day, this was very successful in that no top-down, perhaps burdensome legislation coming from the government ended up happening. So can you tell us a little bit more of the story from your perspective and discuss this idea of proactively starting a conversation between scientists and civic leaders, and whether this model can be used in other contexts in society?
You know, the scientific community is the first place where we know about new discoveries, new perspectives coming from new technology. And in general, people wait until this permeates out of the scientific community into the larger body politic to wonder whether what's going on is requires some kind of regulation. We decided, and we were a group of people who found ourselves thinking about recombinant DNA capabilities when they first became aware, we first became aware of them. And we decided to get sort of ahead of the issue because it seemed potentially very explosive. And we knew that if it exploded without any control, without any leadership, it could be devastating for the application of these new techniques to scientific questions. At the same time, we were convinced completely that this was going to revolutionize our science. It enabled us, it enabled me as a scientist to do things that I desperately wanted to do, but had never seen a way to get at. And so I didn't want to see this regulations explode around it because they were going to be almost inevitably a block in front of the use of the technology. And also the questions that were being raised about whether the power of these techniques could also lead to the generation of chimeric organisms that would have new and frightening properties. They were real questions. And we could see how the techniques could be used in ways that would be inappropriate. We were particularly concerned about biological warfare at that time. And so we simply said, let's take a pause and asked the scientific community to not do certain kinds of experiments. And that we would organize a conference, which was the Asilomar Conference, to get people internationally thinking about what might be dangerous, what might not be dangerous, how are we going to begin to utilize this technology in the safest possible way. And we were going to do that using the intelligence and insight of the scientific community. So the leadership was going to come from the scientific community. And there were 4 or 5 people who were deeply concerned about this. Maxine Singer being one of those, Paul Berg at Stanford, another, and Sidney Brenner, a few other people. And we formed a sort of organizing committee to generate the Asilomar Conference. We invited people, as I say, from all around the world, lots of microbiologists, because the real initial concern was in microbiology, virologists, because of the concern about creating new kinds of viruses. And we all came together in Asilomar, California, this beautiful conference center, and spent a few days talking to each other, giving lectures on various topics that related to the technology, and finally coming out with a statement that we thought the technology should move ahead, but in a controlled manner. There should be oversight from the federal government, which in the end there was. That was for America. Of course, the rest of the world had to make its own decisions. But the rest of the world fell into line behind America in this. And in fact, the outlines of procedures that we generated there and the ongoing process of actually liberating ourselves from the restrictions that we had set up were all done in the United States and then followed by the rest of the world without a single example of anybody transgressing it. And it's a model, I think it's in fact the most important model to come out of Asilomar, because it said we have no standing to make laws for the whole world. We have only standing to make laws for our own country. But we can all agree that there are certain things we ought to be doing, and that there's a certain pace at which we should begin to test out the limits. And we should do that as a single scientific community, even though the people came from all around the world. So that's a little look at what was a very big and important operation.
Thank
you
you.
had another piece to that question, which I've forgotten.
Yeah, are there other processes that, other situations that you think should emulate what happened there, especially now?
Right. Interestingly, I'm not sure there are. And the reason is because most problems that come up have a larger ethical dimension. We tried very hard at Asilomar to maintain a focus on the technical side, on the technology itself and what it could do and what it might do in the greatest imagination. But we didn't try to generate an ethical framework for this. We said, we're just scientists. We can't dictate the ethical and moral decisions of the society and of the world. Other people have to do that. And the kinds of problems that are coming up now, for instance, gene editing, which is another area where I've run international meetings, is much more a problem of, let me say, is as much a problem of ethics or morality, really, as it is a problem of science. And so it can only be dealt with in a much broader social context than Asilomar provided. There have been a couple of other meetings that, like Asilomar, in other fields. And one that's interesting is geoengineering, trying to use large-scale engineering. I'm sure Franz knows about this, to deal with climate change issues, which is a very technical kind of problem and lends itself to the same kind of consideration. But the thing that has caught the imagination of many people is genome editing. And that doesn't lend itself so simply.
Thank you. So following up on that story, because I think that what you described, where you asked the scientific community to just take a pause and everybody takes a pause, is something that I have trouble imagining happening today, especially because we have so many more people doing science. But I think many people in the audience have been doing science for less than 10 years. I have. And so we might have some trouble imagining how could what is happening today not be special and different. we are often tempted to conclude that we are always living in unprecedented times. And so my question is to both of you. Throughout your careers, what changes have you seen in the interplay between science and politics? Do you think that there is more partisanship now, more emotions? And particularly with regards to science denialism, where a lot of people, for example, now are against the COVID-19 vaccines. Is that a new thing, or is that a thing that has always been in society?
Well, I'll just start. We're always living by definition in unprecedented times. Today, with all the social media opportunities, there's a lot. The stage is much more crowded. There's a lot of people there with their voices, and those were arguably voices that were always there to some degree, but there weren't outlets for their voices to be heard as clearly as they are now, and so that's really led to a worldwide stage where everybody can play a part, and that's a good thing, and it has its challenges. So yeah, I think David's example and talking about that in the Asilomar and DNA, recombinant DNA and so forth, and its difference from the big global crises that we're facing now with the pandemic and climate change, and I'll put artificial intelligence and what we do with that, in the mix as well, is just that I thought it was very humbling of him to say that the scientists were staying in their own space and trying to deal as scientists with what they could do, should do, and set some boundaries there. Because and acknowledging that science informs policy, but it's not the only voice at the table. And that's what we're learning more and more now, which I think is really important for students, is that that scientists and engineers have to be at the policy table, but they are, and they're an incredibly important word for informing policy going forward. But they're not the final word. There's lots and lots of considerations that have to be taken into account. And so I think that's really changed since in my lifetime, since I started out. So if I take myself back to 1993, when I started at NASA as chief scientist, then it was the administrator, the head of NASA, was worried that there weren't enough scientists informing what the engineering capabilities of NASA. What was it that was important to do from a scientist's point of view? What were the big questions, the fundamental questions? And that was a wonderful thing to do. And I don't think that that's changed at all. Science is still being asked, what are the fundamental questions? What is it that we don't know? What are the big things? What are the big problems we have to go after? But then there are all sorts of other considerations that come into play. And it's when you're doing the basic research, that's my experience, is that there's been bipartisan support for basic research, all the way through the government, and most people are in the public are very, very supportive of basic research. It's when you ask the question, what do we do with what we know? What are the next steps? How do we turn this into technology? And what are their limits on the technology? What are the boundaries? That's where we get into all the questions, the ethical and moral questions that David was hinting at.
I didn't put a date on the Asilomar meeting, but it was 1975. That's a long time ago. And that's when I grew up. I went to graduate school in 1960. And so I was still a young scientist at that time. And I lived in a world in which science was treated as one of the highest callings you could have as an individual. I can remember that when my parents would come together with their friends and talk about their children, if their child was a PhD or an MD or a scientist of one form or another, that was a great success in life. And I think the society in general looked to science as a very positive activity in the world. Remembering that science had been behind the ending of World War II, the very positive outcome of World War II, in the sense that the West dominated over totalitarianism. Democracy did. And that was radar, and it was the atomic bomb, which had its pluses and minuses, and so much else. And that continued following the end of the war. And I don't see that now. I see, particularly with the administration that's just now ending, very deep questioning about the outcome of scientific investigations. That science is not seen as producing sort of incontrovertible truths. Truth is something which is fungible, and is and we talk about fake news or fake facts, if you wish, and that's incomprehensible in the context of the time when I grew up. So I see politics as playing a role in science that it never played before. People take sides about whether science is right or wrong. People take sides about whether the dictates of science is something to follow or something to ignore. And I'm still, I must say, absolutely fixated on the fact that controlled experiments done correctly produce knowledge about the world, and that we can question that knowledge, but it is the best we have at the moment to deal with, and we should use it in the most effective ways. So I would say that if the Y group went to Washington, particularly last year, I guess you did, and if you talk to the agency people like Franz, you would get a picture of science as moving ahead, actually reasonably well funded, focusing on basic questions. But if you went to Congress and asked them about it, you would get a very different view. And it would depend very much on whether you were talking to Republicans or Democrats. And it shouldn't. In fact, when I first started going to Washington, which is decades ago, the Republicans were known for being better stewards of science, producing more money for science, caring more about science than the Democrats. It was not a liberal thing. And I was a little shocked by that since I grew up in a very liberal household. So I would say that we're in a very different world now. And whether we're just going to stay in that world or we're going to somehow get ourselves back to a better appreciation of the epistemological status of science is a big question.
It's interesting to me that other countries have ministers of science. So I several times in the past few years represented the US at these things called G7 meetings for science, where I'd be the US representative, especially when we had the hiatus of a couple of years in the Trump administration, and there wasn't a director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So I would go and do that, and I'd be in Italy or Iceland or Germany with all these ministers of science. And the US still doesn't really have a minister of science. And I know that we, of course, have a director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. It is not a cabinet position like the ministers of science are in other countries. And so what one could say that, that these things, although it's symbolic in some sense, that they are very important symbols, because when you're working on global problems with the rest of the world, like one time I went as our quote minister to the Arctic Ministerial. So we're very worried about what's going on in the Arctic and all the climatic changes that are affecting the entire planet. But we do not have the same status of representation as a minister of science does in other countries. So that's just an observation on the political level of the role that science has. I don't feel it. I'm not as negative as perhaps as David is about the two sides of the aisle. Because from the point of view of the National Science Foundation, you have to remember it's kind of a special agency because it does mainly fund basic research. And both sides of the aisle care very much about basic research and were very supportive. They just had different priorities. So in one administration, there would be a lot of emphasis on climate change and the environment, and another administration, there'd be a lot of emphasis on quantum science and artificial intelligence, and all of that is good, and all of that is science and much more that an agency like the National Science Foundation would fund. But the spotlight was on just different parts of the portfolio. But that didn't mean that the whole of Congress, both sides of the aisle, wasn't supportive of basic research. And in fact, I think it's been characteristic throughout my entire science career that when it comes to the very fundamental research, that there is a lot of support. It doesn't mean uniform support, because some people just simply don't know what the role of basic science is and what it's led to. And that's our job, right, as scientists and engineers, to help inform Congress, and to help inform the public. And but I think there's been a lot of support. It just gets to be tricky when you deal with these issues that are more global in context and require international partners, that have to do with that kind of impinge on the regulatory framework. And what are you going to do about climate change? I mean, what are you going to implement in order to mitigate its damaging effects and that sort of thing? And then you get into this tricky sphere where you have a lot of questions come up on different sides of the aisle.
Can I ask Franz a question?
Absolutely.
As I have grown up in science, one of the things that I was surprised about was that there was no Minister of Science. And I talked to a lot of people about that over the years. And they emphasized that not having a single focus of science, a minister, has been very positive for the development of science in the United States. Because we have so many agencies, each of which has its own particular head. So Franz was head of National Science Foundation, and somebody else was head of NIH, somebody else is head of the military science wings, which can be very important. And it meant that if you had a good idea and you couldn't convince Franz it was a good idea, you could go try to convince somebody else, because there wasn't a monolithic science czar in the United States. And I've always bought that argument. But I've never seen it in the context of an international meeting where you're not treated with the same respect because you don't have as broad a portfolio. So I'm curious how you would play off those two considerations against each other.
Sure. Well, one is good for science, and I completely agree that having a diversity of agencies, and I have to say, for me, one of the most interesting and exciting parts of my portfolio was the interaction with the other agencies and all the projects we supported together. I mean, when you think that DOE and NSF are putting together the same big telescope to look at the transient cosmos, and NIST and NSF are working together in quantum science and DOE and so on. I mean, those are all thrilling things, and I completely agree. But so what the Y students, Caltech Y students who come to Washington are most interested in my assessment is the interplay between science and policy. And the idea of a minister or somebody who represents in the eyes of the rest of the world what is the policy position after collecting the wisdom of the various heads of agencies, the wisdom of the administration, Congress, very demanding job, but nevertheless, that you are representing what the United States view is, and it has to be, as at any policy, international policy table, it has to be a coherent, articulate, consistent point of view that is supported by all branches of government. So that's where the advantage is on the policy side, David, not so much on the science side, because I completely agree with you. So certainly we're clever enough to figure out, how to do this and be represented in worldwide forums where things like, think of the Paris Accords and so on, yeah, where they make a difference and still maintain all the beauty of the diversity of the agencies with their complex portfolios interacting together.
Eduardo, take us somewhere else.
Well, my next question was actually going to be related to precisely that, because you both touched on climate change and on the fact that the government has many agencies and therefore different agencies can try different things. One thing that the pandemic has shown us is that science can collaborate really, really fast. I don't think that, especially the biomedical sciences, have never made such speedy collaboration as they have in this past year, because they have embraced preprints, sharing results that are not yet peer-reviewed, not yet published, a little bit raw, that could very much be wrong, but just putting it out there so someone else can take it and run with it. And this highlights some challenges that the doing of science faces, namely coordination, because the way that science is typically structured is that you have many independent labs that are pursuing their own interests. And in a situation like the pandemic, coordination to focus on one specific direction can be very hard. At the same time, if you try to coordinate too much, you could lose creativity, you could lose on innovation. So my question to you both is, and after this, I think we're going to go to the Q&A, is should there be more centrally coordinated science in the United States? Should the government play more of a role in trying to get labs together and going in one direction, or continue to emphasize the competitive model of independent labs, sometimes racing to get there first, to get their claim to fame?
Well, I think you should do both, and you really easily can do both. It's all about balance. So let me just give you a short example. It started a couple, 2-3 years ago at NSF, a new program called the Convergence Accelerator. And what we were trying to do was, emulate the private accelerators, which really get things going fast and translation happening very, very quickly, but put in some new ways of doing it. Namely, we stated what the goal was, reachable goals in a short enough amount of time, say a couple of years, 2 to 5 years, but then had teams compete with each other, multiple teams, all trying to go for the same goal. So I think we captured the beauty of what you're saying, Eduardo, with having still having this element of competition, an element of teamwork, but positing what was the goal that we were trying to reach for. So, and that's just one program. Basically, we're NSF, at least, and a number of the other agencies, part of NIH and DOE and so on, are all about letting all flowers bloom and creative proposals coming in and awarding the best proposals, no matter how different and variable. But I think you have to also mix it up with a little bit of the translational push when you can see a direction in sight, like you can see where something like the human technology interface using artificial intelligence will lead you. Why not get people all racing together towards that goal?
I happen to be a believer in the role of the individual in science. And I focusing on basic science, and that's an important part of the consideration. I believe that the real advances, the things that make a qualitative difference in how we think, come from a single individual or sometimes a pair of people. And that we must be sure that we don't lose that. So in all the desire for collaboration and coordination and top-down kinds of thinking, that's fine for things that we can define well. And then we say, how do you get there? And we know where we're going, but we don't know all of the details and all of the technology. And so we can then focus on that. Like the Human Genome Project was that sort of thing. And that's fine for that kind of science. But what's really going to make the difference, what's going to be the Einstein moment, is when a single individual sees things differently, says, I'm going to go in that direction. I don't care what you say. may not look like what I'm supposed to be doing, but that's where I think the gold is, and goes and finds it.
Okay, so what I understood is, if you're doing translational science, if you can describe what the goalpost is, then some coordination might be useful.
Oh yeah,
but otherwise, don't tell people what to do.
right.
Okay.
And
So
let me just say that goes to very much the whole educational system. So I can bring it back to Caltech. And one of the great problems that we have in biological sciences, in the biological sciences today, is that we keep our students and postdocs too long in subordinate positions where they don't have the opportunity to develop their own creativity, their own particular set of goals and desires. And so I'm not happy about that. And I take whatever time I can to push people ahead, to say, go jump the next hoop right now. And I'd rather see 28-year-old lab heads than 45-year-old lab heads.
okay, I'm not sure that there are enough PI positions to accommodate everybody, but otherwise, I would love to see 28-year-old lab heads. Because I happen to be 28.
Well, that's when I started in the lab head.
Okay, so we will now transition to our Q&A time with taking questions from the audience. And I want to introduce Elizabeth, who is going to take the questions from now on. So it was a pleasure to talk with you two tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Gallmeyer. I am a fourth-year undergraduate, and I am studying chemistry. And I am also the Vice President of Operations for the Caltech Y Student Executive Committee. So this afternoon, I'll be facilitating the audience Q&A, and we have a lot of great questions, but we unfortunately only have time for a few. So first, we have a question as follows. What is the political role of the scientific community when both major political parties have a bipartisan consensus towards using science for the development of weapons of war, the surveillance apparatus, and tools of police and imprisonment? Furthermore, what do U.S. scientists owe the communities in this country and abroad who are dispossessed of their land and resources?
Those are two big, frightening questions.
Yeah.
Let me say that for the first one, that it goes to a very deep question about the organization of society. We are a series of 200 odd countries on this planet, each of which has its own concerns, its own desires, and which wants to keep itself free to move in its own directions. And so it has an army that an Army, Navy, Air Force that protects the borders of the country, protects the interests of the country, and worries about the potential enemies that the country has. So we need a military. We need to do things with the highest possible technical skill. And that leads us into problems. Each city has its own needs. So how do we maintain all of these militaristic aspects of our society and yet be sure that they don't dominate our freedoms and our freedoms, we'll put it that way. And we used to be reasonably comfortable with that in the United States. But I must say the present administration, now ending administration, has shown the limits to which you can go when you have control over the weapons of suppression. And so we're learning that we have to protect our freedoms better than we have. And the picture of the clearing of Washington from protesters so that a picture could be taken is to me a symbol of exactly what we don't want to see our country doing. And means that we have to be very careful to guard our ability to protest carefully.
Yeah, I would only add that the whole genesis of some of the science agencies like the National Science Foundation came about because of the more political role of the scientific community in the Second World War. And that's when many university presidents and scientists like Vannevar Bush took an active role in having science inform the war effort. Scientists like Szilard and Einstein, a number of others tried to inform the government about the buildup of the arms race and all. I mean, there was really an engagement of science and politics and the politics of war. So much so that there was the recognition after the war that scientists and engineers really had something to say about the whole political apparatus, and the government should be funding them more to do the science that would help us be safe and healthy as a country. And so hence the creation of agencies like the National Science Foundation. So I think it's good that science does continue to inform all kinds of policy, including the global policy that question alludes to. As far as the second part of the question about scientists and the people who are dispossessed, I mean, scientists have to do, as David stressed early on in his comments about Asilomar, they have to continue to be scientists and make their contribution where they're best informed and what they know. And my experience with that part of the question is the agricultural scientists that I knew working at various universities like Riverside and like Purdue, where were people who had hailed from other countries and then were faculty at those universities would be giving back by helping to grow crops and transform crops and grain production and all sorts of agricultural methods to help them be safer. I think that question is very large. It asks about a bigger role. I think scientists have incredible opportunity and power to do transformative things when they stick to their science, but with the consciousness that this can really help people worldwide.
Yes, thank you both for tackling that very large question. So I guess we have time for one more question. And that is the following. This pandemic has allowed for this question. Is the recent decline of science's role in society due to political discourse, or is it due to shortcomings of the scientific industry? And what can we do about it?
We don't have a lot of time. I will answer that very quickly. It seems to me that the scientific community has not changed at all and is very devoted to the discovery of the truths of nature and how those affect the workings of society. The problem is that people are questioning the doing of science on the basis of it producing uncomfortable truths, as Al Gore reminded us, and we simply have to adapt to those truths because they're not going away.
Yeah, I agree with that. I did, if since we're just winding up, I wanted to comment on another question, if I could, just for a second, that I see there. I don't think that the person that says that comment that there were no pluses to the atomic bomb and to apply that there was is less than honest. I think it's an illustration that there were some very, very challenging moments, as there always have been in the past and will continue to be, challenging moments in which scientists are called upon to give their to be involved and to be to use their science to inform as best that they can, to inform the government of what they think, what they believe is happening, what they believe is true. And that is all about context. Nobody really knows where things are going to be headed, what they're going to necessarily be used for. But I think what is honest to do is to be truthful about what your science is about, what it can deliver, what your concerns are about others delivering on that science. And so it's it's hazardous to pass judgment on another time. You have to get into it, into the history of it, and really understand all the things that moved people to do as they did. But it's also not a good thing to just be totally disengaged from what is happening. If you know something, if your knowledge is such about science, and we're about to do something, to get in there and to weigh in with your decisions. And that's part of the whole human endeavor. And I think the whole Caltech Y forum and what the Caltech Y is after when they go to Washington is to understand these tensions that are presented between what is, the very complex questions about what is the right thing to do and how far we can move towards this. And scientists have a role to play, as we said earlier, not the only role, but they have an important role to play, and they need to make their voices heard.
Thank you, both of you. I will now turn it over to Albert to close off the event.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hello, my name is Albert Chi, and I'm a sophomore from New York City, hoping to major in chemical engineering and a member of the Science Policy Symposium organization team. And it is my pleasure to close out today's panel. We want to thank Dr. Baltimore and Dr. Córdova for taking time out of their packed schedules to meet with us today. Even though we at Caltech are members of the engineering and science disciplines, we cannot ignore that our work and research are part of a larger society, one in which politics and science inevitably cross paths. And so we appreciate both of you giving your insights into this intersection. I personally learned a lot from your discussions about how and when science should be coordinated in academia and government, as well as your commentary on the limits of scientists' role in ethics and policy decision-making. This keynote panel is part of the larger Caltech Y Washington, D.C. Science Policy Symposium. Currently celebrating our 15th year, the Y Science Policy Symposium has always been a student-organized dive into the interplay between policy and science. We are so glad to be able to offer a keynote with such esteemed panelists for the first time, which is just one of many changes the pandemic has enabled us to make. If you're interested in learning more about the Science Policy Symposium or the Student Activism Speaker Series, please feel free to email us at caltechy@caltech.edu. Thank you again, Dr. Baltimore and Dr. Córdova, for what has been an extremely engaging and informative hour, and we hope to see you all again in the future.